This is a true story, and the HOA has long been a thorn in the side of the residents. Here's the full story.
Susan supported her. Bill, Maria, and David were often caught in the middle, trying to maintain civility and find consensus. My job, the reason I ran, was no longer just about implementing good policies. It was a constant, draining fight to defend reasonable governance against the persistent push for excessive control and punitive enforcement. The ability to park in our driveways remained a small, tangible victory from the early days. It was a reminder of why I started. But the initial feeling of empowerment had been replaced by the reality of the ongoing struggle. Fighting Karenism wasn't a one-time battle. It was a continuous effort, requiring vigilance, patience, and a willingness to engage in the messy, frustrating work of community politics. My anger hadn't disappeared. It had matured into a stubborn determination, a commitment to stay on the board, to keep pushing back, to prevent the pendulum from swinging back to the suffocating control I had fled. The fight for a fair HOA free from petty tyranny was the real long-term project, and I was in it for the long haul. The moving truck rumbled away, taking with it the last physical pieces of my old life. But it didn't take the memory. It didn't take the knot of frustration that used to tighten in my stomach every time I saw an official-looking envelope in the mailbox. It didn't take the simmering anger that lingered from the constant battles, the petty rules, the feeling of being powerless under the arbitrary authority of one small self-important woman. It didn't take the ghost of the old HOA Karen. That woman, let's just call her Brenda, because honestly, the name fits, had been the unofficial queen of my old neighborhood HOA. Not even the president, just a board member with an outsized personality and an insatiable need for control. She micromanaged everything, from the exact shade of mulch allowed to the precise minute your trash cans had to be out and back in. She issued fines like candy, targeted residents she didn't like, and ruled through intimidation and a relentless barrage of passive-aggressive emails. She was the reason good neighbors argued, the reason board members resigned in exasperation, the reason living there started to feel less like owning a home and more like being a tenant in a badly run, overly strict institution. That place became toxic and Brenda was the source code. Leaving wasn't easy, but staying felt impossible. I needed a fresh start, a place where I didn't wince every time a white sedan with a community logo drove past. We found this townhome community, new construction, modern design, friendly-looking neighbors during the walkthroughs. It felt like a breath of fresh air, a chance to escape the Karen energy field. But the escape wasn't just about finding a new address. It was about preventing a repeat. I'd seen firsthand what happens when good people stay silent, when the loudest, most controlling voices dominate. I'd grumbled, I'd vented, I'd even tried a polite email or two in the old place, but I hadn't acted. I hadn't tried to change the system from within. Moving here, that changed. I arrived with the usual boxes and furniture, but I also arrived with a quiet, burning resolve. I didn't want another Brenda. I didn't want to spend years being policed on minor infractions, watching community funds disappear into questionable projects, or feeling like my own property wasn't truly mine. I knew with absolute certainty that the only way to guarantee a non-Karen future was to step up myself. I ran for the HOA board. Felt strange at first, putting my name on a ballot in a community where I barely knew anyone. My campaign was simple, fueled entirely by my past trauma. I talked to neighbors I met unpacking, people I saw walking their dogs. I didn't have fancy flyers. My pitch was honest. I moved from a neighborhood with a really difficult HOA. I saw how easily things can go wrong when the wrong people are in charge. I'm running for the board because I want to help make sure that doesn't happen here. I believe in clear communication, fair rules, and focusing on the things that actually matter for our community, not petty power plays. I specifically mentioned one thing that had already caught my eye, the seemingly arbitrary enforcement of parking rules. Even before I ran, I'd heard some grumbling. Residents were apparently getting warnings, even fines, for parking in their own driveways, even when they weren't blocking sidewalks or mailboxes. It seemed like exactly the kind of overreach that signaled potential Karen territory. My simple promise: if elected, I'll push for common-sense parking rules that respect homeowners' right to use their own driveways. To my surprise and relief, I got elected. Maybe enough people had similar bad experiences elsewhere, or maybe my simple, trauma-fueled honesty resonated. Suddenly, I wasn't just a resident grumbling about the HOA. I was part of it. Joining the board was an experience. There were 5 of us. The president, a seemingly nice older gentleman named Bill, who had been on the board for years. Maria, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who ran her own business. David, quiet and analytical, seemed to know the bylaws inside and out. And then there was Susan. Susan wasn't Brenda. Not overtly, at least not at first glance. She was polite, smiled a lot and spoke softly. But there was something about her questions, her focus on minor details, her insistence on strict adherence to specific, sometimes outdated rules, that sent a tiny cold shiver down my spine. A little voice in my head whispered, "Watch out." My first priority, as promised, was the parking rule. At the first board meeting, I brought it up. "Look," I said, "I've heard from several residents, and I've seen it myself. People are getting grief for parking in their own driveways. As long as they're not blocking access or violating safety codes, our driveways should be usable space for our cars, especially in a townhome community where parking is already limited." Bill nodded thoughtfully. David flipped through the bylaws. Maria looked receptive. Susan, however, straightened up, her soft smile unwavering but her eyes gaining a familiar, hard glint. "The current rule is in place to maintain the aesthetic uniformity of the streetscape," she stated calmly. "Vehicles parked in driveways detract from the clean lines of the community." Aesthetic uniformity. There it was. The language of petty control. "Respectfully, Susan," I said, choosing my words carefully, trying not to let the memory of Brenda make me too aggressive too soon. "The primary purpose of a driveway is for parking. Homeowners should have the right to use it unless it causes a genuine problem. Prioritizing aesthetic uniformity over basic functionality and homeowner convenience seems like an overreach." The discussion was tense, but thankfully Bill, Maria, and David agreed with me. We passed a motion to revise the parking rule to allow driveway parking, provided no other rules like blocking sidewalks or mailboxes were violated. It was a small victory, but it felt huge. The next day, I saw cars parked in driveways up and down the street, cars that used to be crammed into guest spots or parked awkwardly further away. Residents looked visibly relieved. Some waved, offering thanks. It was a tangible, positive change, and it fueled my determination. I had made a difference. I had pushed back against a potentially Karen-like rule, and the community benefited. But changing one rule, even a visible one like parking, didn't fix everything. It turned out the problems in this new community were different from the old one, but just as challenging, and my fight against Karenism was far from over. The first major issue that landed on our laps was unexpected maintenance. A section of retaining wall near the community entrance started crumbling. It wasn't just an eyesore. It was a structural issue, potentially impacting the sidewalk and even the road. The repair estimate came back eye-watering. Our reserve funds, while not actively rated like in my old neighborhood, were nowhere near sufficient to cover it. This led to the dreaded discussion of a special assessment, an extra fee levied on every homeowner. Suddenly, I was on the other side of the equation, part of the board that had to tell residents their HOA fees, which weren't exactly cheap to begin with, were about to go up significantly just for this one repair. Announcing the special assessment was met with exactly the kind of anger and frustration I expected. Residents, understandably, were upset. Emails flooded in, some polite questions, some outright furious accusations. This is where the new drama really began to unfold. Susan, the board member who had raised red flags for me, suddenly found her voice amplifying the complaints, but not in a constructive way. She demanded to know why the previous board hadn't saved more, a valid question, but her tone was accusatory towards Bill, the long-serving president. She questioned the contractor's estimate, suggesting we were being ripped off, without providing any evidence. She started emphasizing other, minor issues, landscaping imperfections, paint touch-ups needed on trim, implying that HOA money was being wasted elsewhere while essential repairs were neglected. It felt less like genuine concern and more like sowing discord. Then a resident emerged as a vocal antagonist. A woman named Carol, different Carol, from Unit 14. Carol wasn't on the board, but she was loud, opinionated, and seemed to have an endless supply of free time. She latched onto the special assessment issue, organizing an impromptu resident meeting in the common area. I attended, Hoping to explain the situation transparently, Carol stood on a bench, addressing a crowd of about 30 neighbors. She wasn't just complaining about the assessment. She was launching a full-blown attack on the board and specifically, it felt, on my approach. Ever since the new board members joined, she announced dramatically, clearly targeting me, the newest one, the focus has been on trivial things like parking, while the real problems, the structural integrity of our entrance, the financial planning, have been ignored. We need a board that prioritizes the actual value of our homes, not letting people turn the neighborhood into a parking lot. There it was. A new form of Karenism emerging. Not just arbitrary rule enforcement, but a demanding critical attitude combined with a narrow, often self-serving view of what constitutes priorities for the entire community. Carol positioned herself as the guardian of property values and standards, quickly dismissing anyone who voiced different concerns, like, wanting to park in their driveway. She started echoing Susan's talking points about financial mismanagement and misplaced priorities. My initial anger towards Brenda from the old neighborhood had been about feeling controlled and unfairly targeted. Now I felt a different kind of anger, rising frustration at the resistance to reasonable change and the emergence of new voices of discontent that seemed determined to undermine progress and create division. The board meetings became more tense. Susan and I often clashed. She'd push for stricter enforcement on minor aesthetic rules, fining for recycling bins left out too long, demanding specific types of flowers in flower beds, criticizing small decorations. I'd push back, arguing for warnings over fines, communication over punishment, focusing on issues that actually impacted safety or significant property value. Bill, Maria, and David tried to mediate, sometimes siding with me, sometimes trying to find a compromise that appeased Susan. It was exhausting. I was spending hours on HOA matters, reading emails, preparing for meetings, researching bylaws, fielding resident complaints. More hours than I ever expected. The anger that drove me to run was now being tested, warped by the grinding reality of community politics. Dealing with Carol from Unit 14 was another challenge. She started emailing the entire resident list, criticizing board decisions, often distorting facts, questioning expenditures, and generally stirring the pot. Her main target seemed to be the perceived lax enforcement under the new board's influence, meaning my influence. She demanded stricter rules on everything from noise to kids playing to where visitors could park. She was the classic resident who wanted the HOA to be her personal enforcement squad for every minor annoyance. I tried talking to her directly, explaining the board's reasoning, the financial realities. It was useless. She had her narrative, her view of how things should be, and anyone who deviated was ruining the neighborhood. She accused me, the person who ran specifically to prevent petty tyranny, of lacking leadership and catering to rule breakers. The irony was infuriating. My anger towards her was less about fear, like with Brenda, and more about sheer, exasperated frustration at her unreasonable demands and disruptive tactics. The pressure was constant. Residents who were happy about the parking rule were quiet. Residents who were unhappy about the special assessment or agreed with Carol's call for stricter rules were loud. I felt like I was constantly on the defensive, trying to justify reasonable policies against a tide of complaints fueled by a few vocal antagonists. The financial situation didn't get easier. The retaining wall repair depleted our already strained reserves. This meant every unexpected expense, a sprinkler system failure, a minor fence repair, became a crisis. We had to consider raising the regular HOA fees again, just a year after the special assessment. This, predictably, ignited another wave of resident anger, giving Carol and Susan more ammunition. This is a direct result of poor financial planning by the current board. Carol would trumpet in emails. Susan would grill Bill and me in meetings. Did we explore every cost-cutting measure? Are we sure these repairs are absolutely necessary right now? Perhaps we could prioritize stricter enforcement on violations to generate more revenue from fines. Her favorite solution: fine people more. I found myself walking a tightrope. I had run to stop unreasonable fines and excessive control. But now, faced with genuine financial need, the idea of using fines for actual impactful violations, not just parking, as a revenue source became a grim reality. I had to argue for reasonable fee increases and necessary special assessments, which felt dangerously close to becoming the thing I hated. I had to enforce some rules, even small ones, to maintain order, risking being seen as just another HOA guy dishing out notices. The anger I felt morphed again. It wasn't just the initial burning rage against a specific bully. It was a grinding, weary anger at the systemic difficulty of doing things right in an HOA. It was frustration at the vocal minority who could disrupt the peace. It was the internal conflict of having to make unpopular decisions for the long-term health of the community, knowing some residents would see me as the new villain. The tension escalated towards the annual general meeting. Carol from Unit 14 announced she was running for the board. Her platform? Restoring standards, financial accountability, while opposing fee increases and assessments, and bringing back order, meaning stricter enforcement. Susan publicly praised Carol's initiative, making it clear they were aligned. My initial fear about Susan was now confirmed. She wasn't just resistant. She was actively seeking to shift the board's power dynamic, potentially creating the very environment I had fled. The Karen energy hadn't been prevented. It had simply found new hosts. The annual meeting was packed. More residents than usual, drawn by the controversy and Carol's active campaigning. The atmosphere crackled with anticipation. Brenda's ghost felt present in the room, a reminder of how easily things could devolve. Carol spoke first, her voice loud and confident. She hammered on the special assessment, the potential fee increase, the retaining wall repair, blaming the current board for not anticipating it, somehow. She criticized the relaxed parking rules, painting a picture of chaos and declining property values. She promised stricter enforcement, fiscal responsibility without explaining how, and a return to the standards that were supposedly slipping. She was a polished performer, hitting all the right notes for a certain segment of the community, the ones who wanted someone else to blame, the ones who prioritized appearance above all else, the ones who were easily swayed by confident, if misleading, rhetoric. Then it was my turn to speak. As a sitting board member seeking to continue guiding the community, I didn't have Carol's performative flair. I had spreadsheets, budgets, explanations of the repair necessity, details on why the special assessment was unavoidable, plans for long-term financial health. I spoke about the complexity of managing a community, the unexpected costs, the need for shared responsibility. I defended the change in parking rules, citing homeowner satisfaction and lack of actual negative impact. I addressed the crime issue, which had thankfully plateaued, not increased since I joined, though Carol still mentioned it. My voice wasn't fueled by raw rage anymore, but by a deep, weary conviction and the lingering memory of why I started this fight. I looked out at the faces, some supportive, some skeptical, some clearly swayed by Carol's speech, and saw echoes of the residents in my old neighborhood, divided and manipulated. I spoke about building a real community, one based on open communication, shared responsibility, and reasonable governance, not fear or petty rules. I directly contrasted my approach with one based on blame and excessive fines. I didn't name Carol or Susan directly, but the implication was clear. The election results were close. Carol got a significant number of votes, enough to worry me. But enough residents also saw through the rhetoric, or appreciated the changes we had made, like the parking, or simply preferred my approach. I was re-elected, but Carol also won a seat on the board. The resolution wasn't the satisfying downfall of a single villain, like I had perhaps subconsciously hoped for based on my past experience. It was more complicated. Now, the Karen energy wasn't just outside the board, stirring up trouble. It was on the board, sitting right next to me, in the form of Carol, often backed by Susan. Board meetings became battlegrounds. Every decision was debated, every expenditure questioned, every rule interpretation challenged. Carol pushed relentlessly for stricter rules on everything: garbage cans, lawn ornaments, fences, noise.